Hello guys, my name is Mateusz Kolosowski. I'm an international master from Poland, and you may know me, for instance, because of my course that I've developed in cooperation with the Remote Chess Academy, which covered weaknesses in Rook Endgames. And this is, in this video, I wanted to show you a pretty interesting Rook Endgame involving a pair of rooks on each side, played between Levon Aronian and Francisco Vallejo, Pons from Spain. Levon Aronian, the superstar of Armenian chess and of chess in general, of course. At the moment of the game, he was 2800. Francisco Vallejo, 3 points shy of being 2700. So also very strong player. This is Olympiad 2012. And in this position on the diagram, Aronian obviously had to recapture the knight. He plays with white, and we have a very interesting rook endgame. As you see, Aronian is up a pawn, but after f takes g5, which was played in the game, we need to consider the pawn structure. As you probably recall, or maybe this is a new information for you. In chess and also in rook endgames, there can be two main types of weaknesses, pawn weaknesses, such as doubled pawns here or on g-file. It could also be an isolated pawn, such as this little fellow on h2. We don't really see a backward pawn here, but you will see one in a moment. So when it appears on the board, I will tell you about that. Also, some people claim that king can be weak. And in fact, in rook endgames, this sometimes becomes a theme. I'm going to show you that in a separate video, so here we are not really going to be covering that. But the resulting pawn structure is quite interesting. And you could expect Levon Aronian to play a move like rook takes g5. After all, this just captures the pawn. What can be bad about it? He gets rid of the pawn on g5, also maybe getting access to the black king along the g-file. If such a move took place on the board, I'm pretty sure Francisco Vallejo would just take the pawn back on f3 with the clear intention of bringing the other rook to f8 and attacking the pawn on f2. So at this point, I can imagine the thought process of Levon Aronian, and he realized that this is not the way to go. Instead, active play is required, and this is actually the main topic of this video. That in rook endgames, attacking weaknesses is important, but activity very often outweighs those weaknesses, and I'm sure you're going to understand why in a moment. So first, Aronian plays rook c7, activating the second rook and making sure that, well, both of the rooks are involved in the game. Here, one of the rooks is hitting the pawn on g7. I wouldn't say this is a weakness, but this is definitely a target. Why not a weakness? Because again, we distinguish isolated pawns, doubled pawns, and backward pawns. This is not a backward pawn. A backward pawn is a pawn which is sort of the last in the line. Its colleagues, its neighbors are way ahead of him. It's not a situation here, but the g7 pawn is definitely going to be the target if, for instance, black does something like rook takes f3. Then I'm sure that Aronian didn't want to take the pawn on g5, and instead he had rook d2 d7 in mind, and have a look how brilliantly these two rooks are positioned. Not only the pawn on g7 is going to fall, but also the pawn on h7 and the black king is going to be in great danger. And the worst thing that the black could do here is to opt for rook a to f8. I had to show you that because you don't see a forced checkmate in a rook endgame like that. And after all, putting the rook on f8 is such a logical move. Black just wanted to win the pawn on f2. but that would never happen. After rook c7, Francisco Vallejo realized the danger and he played rook f7. Rook f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7. And the position remains, structurally speaking, it remains pretty much the same as it was a moment ago, with the difference that currently it is Aronian that has an active rook versus Vallejo having a passive rook. When we look at the pawn structure, again, it is possible to capture the pawn on g5, but Aronian must have recognized that after rook takes g5, which looks like a perfectly decent move, Vallejo is going to have a chance to activate this rook from a8, for instance by putting it to c8, then potentially bringing the rook to c1 with a check, or even directly to c2, hitting those two pawns, also restricting the white king along the second rank. If that happened, I'm not really sure how Aronian could think of an advantage. These two pawns are by no means stronger than the black pawns on g7 and h7. So even though white is up a pawn, virtually this is not going to be relevant at all. I'm sure that such a position is just equal. So instead of capturing this weak pawn, Aronian played properly. He played actively and made sure that some other targets are there on the board. And therefore he just played rook d7 check. This move practically forces black to go with the king back to g8 or f8, because if the king went to f6 or g6, rook d6 check would follow, and it's much more important to win this pawn on b6 rather than the doubled pawn on g5. This is a weak pawn. It's not as strong as the pawn in a straight pawn formation, and also white would be able to create a passed pawn on queenside. King g8 is forced, and rook d7 was strong because it forced black to occupy a less favorable position. Rook b7 was played, b5, rook b6, rook c8 and b4. And after this pawn structure on queenside is fixed, the pawn on a6, so the only one highlighted right now, is a backward pawn. So earlier on we didn't have the chance to explain what the backward pawn is. Here a backward pawn exists on the board. It is weak because, as you can see, the only way for black to protect it is by involving the rook in doing so, and the only move to do that would actually be to go rook a8. And what you need to understand in Rook Endgames is that piece activity is particularly important, and the best possible situation is to have the rook placed behind the pawns. So in this case, it could theoretically be rook a8 because the rook is behind the pawn, but unfortunately for him, the rook only has two squares available, a8 and a7. So we can conclude that the scope of the black rook is very limited, comparing to the white rook, which is of course enjoying full freedom along the 6th rank, also having the possibility of getting to b7 if needed, to restrict black along the 7th rank. At this point Vallejo went back rook a8, and this is a mistake. It was necessary to play actively, and this is something I would like you to remember from this example. So the only reasonable move at this point was rook c4, and for instance after a3, black goes rook c3, rook takes a6, rook takes f3, exchanging the pawns. For example, king e2, rook b3, it's necessary to keep an eye on these two fellows. And if white played something like rook a5, the following line, this is maybe not forcing, but quite a logical one, and with such an active rook, the possibility of playing rook a3 if needed. Also have a look that the rook is behind the pawn because the pawn on b4 wants to go up, so with every single step the black rook is going to be more active and the white rook is going to be restricted by the pawn, which is going to go forward. And black's position is okay. This should be enough for a draw. And it's quite a strange decision for a player like Francisco Vallejo, 2700 player for many years, and the fact that he didn't go for the active play with the rook is quite surprising, to be honest. And as mentioned, he played rook a8. There was a3, king f7, king g2, h6. At this point, Aronian probably rushed a little bit with f4, and it was much better to play king g3 first and only prepare this f4 move. When you have space advantage and more activity comparing to your opponent, you don't really need to go for fancy moves like that to try to be smart with temporary pawn sacrifices. King g3 was just stronger, preparing f4 and only then playing it. So f4 was there on the board. G takes f4, king f3, rook c8. And this is the problem. With the king on f3, black actually does threaten to go rook c3, rook a3 check. So Aronian was virtually forced to take on a6. And finally, Vallejo started playing actively with rook c2. Although, at this point, he also made a mistake. It was even stronger to go rook c3 check. And if white took the pawn on f4, there is rook h3. And again, we have the same pattern. The rook attacking the pawn on a3, keeping an eye on it, just not allowing it to advance, and hitting the pawn on h2. So white is facing the possibility of losing some material here. This was the best practical approach. Instead, Vallejo opted for rook c2, so he was probably hoping to see an exchange of those pawns, but that never happened, because of course white is not forced to take on f4. After rook c2 there was h4, g5, and rook takes h6. g5, the intention of playing g5 is obviously to protect the pawn on f4. I'm not sure if this is the strongest. If it wasn't for this move, white had a chance of playing h5, fixing these pawns, this pawn structure. So at the end of the day, I think that Vallejo missed his chance with rook c3. After rook takes h6, this is, I know it's still a complex position, but for a player like Levon Aronian, it's quite a clear win. There was rook c3 check, king e4, rook takes, no, sorry, not rook takes c3. First there was g takes f4, h4, rook takes h4, and only now rook takes a3. White is about to win a pawn, he does that, and if only Vallejo somehow had the time to exchange those two pawns, it would of course be a draw. Also, if he exchanged the f pawn for the b pawn, that would also be a draw. Unfortunately for him, he's going to lose the pawn on b5 as well, and this is in fact what happened. Black tried to activate his king, he went king e6, but after rook f5, rook a2, f3, it's important to protect this pawn on f3 and not allow a direct exchange of the pawns. If you see this position, rook takes b5, rook takes f2, it's a draw, it's a pretty standard situation. White is not going to be able to promote. But with f3, safeguarding this pawn and making sure that there will be advantage of two pawns, after rook e2, king f4, Vallejo just resigned in view of rook takes b5. With two pawns advantage, white will just advance with one of the pawns, make sure that black deals with those two pawns with all of his pieces, all of the pieces he has, and he's going to use that time to promote the other pawn. So this is pretty essential, and Vallejo understood that there's no point in playing further. So as you could see, there were weaknesses over the board, and thanks to the fact that Aronian forced Vallejo to defend passively, he was able to win the endgame, even though there was a material balance. And it was crucial that Vallejo missed the chance of playing the less straightforward continuations, which involved even sacrificing the pawn at the cost of having having the active pieces at the cost of sacrificing the pawn. But if you have a choice like that, often you need to pick activity over material, because an active rook is worth much more than a single pawn. I hope you enjoyed this example, and thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this video, there is one more thing that you will enjoy as well. Recently, I've been analyzing the results of different students of the Remote Chess Academy, and I've been checking who are the guys who got the greatest amount of progress. And it came down to the group of people who studied some of our most fundamental courses, such as the Grandmaster's Positional Understanding. And not only those guys studied these courses, but they also really mastered the skill. And that's the level that helps you to gain 3, sometimes even 5 additional 100 rating points just after mastering a certain one course. And that's why I've decided to open a new enrollment for this course. This way you're not just going to be studying watching the video lessons, but you will also get my personal support. I'll be helping you in case you have any questions, you can ask them. You will also have the connection to the other students who are within the same group. And finally, you'll be also receiving certain tasks that will help you to practice and to master the skills necessary. That's why we're going to open up this enrollment, get a certain group of students that we can handle and provide my personal attention to, and then we're going to close the enrollment and stop accepting new students. So if you don't want to miss out, if you want to be in that group of people who are going to significantly improve their chess results after studying and mastering this program, check out the link down below and I'll see you there.